try not to walk on and press down the soil, but keep feeding it. I'm looking through old pictures of what happened at this time of year, and that light color on the soil, that's organic fertilizer. That's probably hollytone that we're using in that particular garden. Organic fertilizers, things that have to be acted on by the soil microbes, you can put down anytime, because as the soil warms up and the microbial activity increases and the soil animal activity increases, those things get released, they get eaten, digested, and their nutrients get released to the plants. Right now, the things that are getting eaten in the warmer places are probably organic materials that were put down last fall or last year. This stuff is going to start breaking down and be available in the summertime.
Yeah.
So keep feeding the soil, but do know that plants, there are nutrients in the soil. This is holly, a holly hedge going up to one of our clients' front doors, and I looked at it one year in early in March and went, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong? We got a nutrient deficiency." To have new foliage come out yellow like that and chlorotic is alarming. And you could use a water-soluble fertilizer with micronutrients in it and spray it on the leaves, and the leaves can absorb it directly. But the reason that these are like this, and the reason that those daffodils, see how yellow those tips are, is that they began to grow when the soil was still so cold. Maybe the warm, it was a very warm year that year that this picture was taken, and there's not nitrogen available in the soil because nitrogen's not available when it's too cold. They'll green up later on. So don't go fertilizing based on what's happening when the snow is still just melting away. And don't fertilize to try to make things denser. The same thing we were saying about the hedge earlier. They want these to be denser. Can we fertilize them? No, light is going to make them denser. It's pruning the maple that's hanging over the top is going to make them denser. And this week we were speaking quite a bit to Amy, who takes care of this gardens on this property, and said, I need to add something to make the soil better because it's just not growing very well here, and I'm thinking that I'll add some organic fertilizer and maybe a mulch, maybe a compost mulch. You know, what can I do? We looked at these pictures and said, well, there's something going on here. Number one, the beds are raised on top of soil that looks to not be supporting lawn well and has probably quite a bit of moss in it as well as lawn. That could be a problem of drainage. It could be a problem of shade. In some cases, it can be a problem of acidity, but that's not the case in Michigan. So we asked Amy to dig us some holes. I said, dig a couple of holes across the interface between that soil that was added and the soil that's there, that was there originally, because it looks to us like there is a problem with the soils communicating with each other. And so if you look at this hole here, which is, she said, that gets full of, the gardens get full of tree roots, you can see the different color between what was on the top. It's a darker and maybe a little bit loamier soil, and then browner underneath. And if you look at where all of the roots are growing, they're growing right at the point where those two soils meet. They're not filling the soil that's been heaped on top in the bed. They're growing where the water goes through that bed and then perches, settles out. It can't move freely between the top layer, which is a different kind of soil, and the bottom layer. And so it falls down to the bottom of the first layer and spreads out in a puddle underground. Those roots looking for moisture are growing in that layer right there. And this is, okay. And this is throughout the area. So the roots are, if people say, oh, there's so many roots, the roots are only at that certain depth. That's where they're growing. We suggested that throughout the garden, to every couple of feet, maybe every 2 or 3 feet, use a drain spade. That's a very narrow spade for digging trenches, narrower than this one, or a post hole digger, or a soil auger like you might use to plant bulbs, and connect those two layers of soil, dig through them so that there is a channel between the two layers so that air, water, and the microorganisms and soil animals can move around between them. It makes a huge difference, and I think it'll make a difference in the fertility. You can look and see the yellow on the holly there. There are some other problems here in this bed. If you look at the base of that tree, it looks like when the property was developed, they added soil, so there may be 3 layers there. They added soil and buried the trunk of that tree, buried the flare of that tree. So take a look at your soil while you've got the chance, before the plants are up and are distracting you entirely. Take a look at what you've got going on underneath, because it's what supports everything you see on top. And there's a lot of this going around. There's a lot of soil stacked on top of other soil.
And drainage issues are going to be another.
And the drainage issue is going to happen on the sandy soil. We've seen people in a sandy soil garden say, well, I need better soil. So they bring in a darker, richer soil and put it on top of the sandy soil. And you still get a perched water table, because the 2 layers have different.
They'll communicate.
They have different pore sizes. But once you get things moving up and down, it makes a huge difference. We did use a post hole digger and made holes in a soil that had a fairly dense brown clay on top of a gray clay, and then sand below that. We made holes every 2 feet in the fall. By the next spring, we were able to dig throughout the garden because everything had moved laterally that quickly.
And by digging it up until then, it was hard. That's why we were using a post hole digger. It was kind of hard to dig in that garden.
Yeah, so very hard to dig in that garden.
Yeah.
So we told Amy, said, dig some holes. You don't have to fill them with anything. You can just let their own soil fall back in loose, and then go ahead and use compost as a mulch to add some more organic matter. But see what happens when the soils start talking to each other. And compost, boy, I remember when compost, you couldn't find it anywhere, but this is one of our municipal composting or corporate composting operations. It's a beautiful operation, and people who are very proud of what they're doing, taking all of those bags of yard waste and turning them into
compost.
Rows.
First, they make rows,
and they turn them with a bulldozer. They're trying to make sure that those get composted quickly.
What they probably do is flip it one way, just flip them over.
Yeah, and make all of that nice compost that you see in the back.
Then they shred it, and there it is.
Beautiful stuff.
Yeah.
Any questions about soil or things you're doing with your own
There's nothing that's come in yet, although Sue has chimed in to say that the only client that they had was that had Muhlenbergia grass was in Grosse Pointe in a protected microclimate. So this might we were giving info from North Carolina, so it could be that it's not as big here. We only had it for 3 years. It was doing well, no spreading. Then they sold the home, and we've not been back. I'll have to go see if I can go peek.
Okay, thanks.
You know what? It's tough to go back to a garden.
It is.
My brother-in-law was saying that he wants to sneak by his house and see what happens. I said, don't go back to it. Once the gardener is gone, the garden changes. So don't go back. Carol wonders whether we should worry about diseases and pests if you take compost into your yard. Compost that's made in
that compost we were just showing.
It's heat in order to make those bags and the leaves and everything break down into that compost that you see. They're heating it to 140 degrees, letting it heat to 140 degrees, and that's killing everything except there are some viruses that can live through that, but that's killing weed seeds. It's killing insect eggs. Compost is pretty cool stuff when it's from a big operation like that. I would worry a little bit about some of the landscape companies near us. Just stack stuff up behind their yard if they've got room, and then they let it break down. I would worry a little bit about that because that's cold compost and stuff can live through that.
Yeah. Sylvia's curious how deep you should dig with that post hole tool.
So you see
change in
the type of soil
that it's bringing up.
That's why Amy dug and took a look at it for us. And I said, well, you need to go down at least as far as you just dug, which is about 10 or 12 inches. In the yard that we were talking about digging the fall, we went
3 feet.
Not 3 feet. We were probably going about 2 feet there.
2 feet. It hurts.
Yeah, because Kurt said 22 inches down. It was yellow sand.
Okay.
So
we went into the sand.
Yeah, so we went until we got the different color soil that we knew was underneath there.
Excellent. Then Susan is asking, I see mushroom compost for sale. Is this good for the garden? I was ready to clarify Oh, Susan says it's stuff left over after commercial mushroom growing. Garden Supply sells it in bags. Is
That's
that good?
right. It's spent mushroom compost, and we used to get spent mushroom compost, and it was
We actually, one job got truckloads.
truckloads of it. The mushroom compost has been grown cool. It was hot composted at one point, but it's been grown cool for X amount of time.
Mhm.
It could, and it may have been setting outside when they cleaned out the beds and put in their new bedding for the next crop of mushrooms. It may have been sitting outside and just like piles of soil setting at landscape supply places. Weed seeds can blow in, things can blow in. So I can't really tell. It's not fresh compost when it's mushroom compost. And remember the one truckload of compost that we got, mushroom compost, where there was a horseshoe in one?
Yeah,
I mean, it came from a farm and they just set it outside, and there were other things in the ground that got scooped up with it.
Yeah.
So it is good stuff, but it might have more.
and they're selling it in
inoculant.
bags. Maybe it's a little bit
Yeah,
cleaner than what we were getting in bulk.
So Margaret is curious about a good local source for compost. Is Sakura still the go-to for Southeast Michigan?
Soccer still is there and participating. Southeast Oakland County Resource Recovery Authority, participating municipalities get compost delivered regularly from the Soccer site, and your own municipal offices, yard, your DPW will have it someplace, and you can pick it up. You can also buy compost at a lot of the landscape firms now. They bring it in bulk. A lot of them then mix it with some sandy soil and call it planting mix, part compost, part sandy soil. They used to do the same thing with peat, peat, part sandy soil, and they would call it 50-50 mix.
Yeah.
50%.
So then we have some questions, clarifications about mulch versus compost. Audrey says, I never understood mulching with compost. I mulch to keep the weeds down. Won't the weed seeds love the new compost? And Sue is asking, do you need to mulch if you add compost to your beds?
You need to mulch if you want to try to suppress the weeds. You can mulch with compost. Compost comes in clean. Yes, things will filter across the top of it. And compost tends to be more moist than bark, or even more moist than shredded leaves. And so, yes, you might get more seeds coming up in it. But if you need the organic matter in your soil, it's a good way to add it. So if you added some compost, but you just added a little bit of compost because you were trying to enrich your soil, put a mulch on top of it.
You get top dress.
If you want to mulch with compost, which we've done before, it looks beautiful. And yes, you're going to have.
It looks English. The English don't use wood mulch.
Yeah.
They use compost in all their beds, and some of those English gardens are weed free.
Yeah.
Well, some of those English gardens come with a very ancient class system of hiring labor to take
Yes.
care.
Wow.
And
That helps too.
And I see Jean is thinking that the garden's going to look pretty funny with all those holes that are dug. You're going to put the soil back over you're going to rake the soil back over after you have dug holes. You just rake everything level. It's a little bit higher.
It's a little weird.
Might be a little bit lumpy here and there, but you're just going to put.
Doesn't look as bad as star moles.
No, it doesn't have big mounds of soil everywhere.
Teresa is wondering if anyone has grown their own worm farm. Thoughts on if you suggest this? I actually have a friend who have had for almost a decade now a terrarium of composting worms in their kitchen where they put their food waste. They ordered them away. I can't remember the variety, the species they got of worms, but they were advertised as the Lamborghini of composting worms. So they've been going on a decade now of getting sort of terrariums full of compost from their kitchen waste.
Sonia probably doesn't remember it because she was so young, but we had worm composting and red wigglers were what we used. Mary Applehoff wrote a book called Worms Eat My Garbage and kind of got things started. And we had a worm bin underneath the kitchen sink where we put things. But the dogs spent all their time standing by the sink listening because they could hear the worms rustling in there. And it got to where I said, this is not going to work. Having the dog standing right where I'm trying to stand and work all the time. So it does work. And as long as you don't mind having a bin that is sitting someplace that you just put things into, they break things down pretty quickly. Okay.
I think that's what we've got for now.
What was the name of that movie we just watched with Henry Winkler and about worms. Henry Winkler and Sally Field.
Was it about worms?
Yeah, he was taking Eureka. He had the box of worms and he was
Oh,
doing
that's
the worm
right, that's
farm.
right. He was gonna start growing
Oh.
worms.
Yeah.
And while we're on worms, Teresa's clarifying that she has a friend that grows them outside, and Donna is clarifying, could you have them in a container? Could you grow them outside? Because you have like a salmon farm out in your yard of worms.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah, you can, and there are people who put them on the back porch, and that's what,
Yep.
Barbara Hayes at the Detroit Garden Center would do. She'd put them out on the back porch, everything but really freezing weather.